There's a photograph that sits in thousands of American homes, tucked into albums, or framed on mantels, or hidden in boxes in the attic. It shows a young man in uniform, smiling, or trying to. The smile doesn't quite reach his eyes. There's something in his expression that's hard to name, something that looks like exhaustion or relief, or maybe just the peculiar emptiness that comes from surviving something you weren't supposed to survive. The photograph was usually taken in 1945 or 1946, after the war ended, after the ticker tape parades, after the ships brought them home. These men, boys really, most of them barely out of their teens, had done what their country asked. They'd crossed oceans, they'd fought in jungles and deserts and frozen forests, they'd watched friends die, they'd killed people they'd never met, people who were probably just as scared as they were. And then suddenly, it was over. The war ended, the celebrations happened, the bands played, the flags waved, and everyone assumed that the soldiers would simply come home, take off their uniforms, and go back to being the people they were before. But that's not what happened. What happened instead was something quieter, more complicated, and far more painful than anyone wanted to admit. What happened was that millions of men came home to a country that expected them to be heroes, but didn't really want to know what they'd been through. What happened was that the war didn't end when the fighting stopped. It just moved inside, into the minds and hearts and nightmares of the men who'd fought it. What happened is that many of them never really came home at all. For decades, we've told the story of World War II as a triumph, and it was. The defeat of fascism, the liberation of Europe, the end of the most destructive conflict in human history, these were monumental achievements. But we've told that story so many times in so many ways that we've smoothed over the rough edges. We've turned the soldiers into symbols, we've made them larger than life. And in doing so, we've forgotten that they were human, and we've forgotten that coming home from war isn't like flipping a switch, that you can't spend years living with death and violence and constant fear and then just walk back into normal life as if nothing happened, that the skills you learn to survive in combat, hypervigilance, emotional numbness, the ability to make split-second decisions about life and death, don't translate well to peacetime, that the things you saw, the things you did, the things that were done to you, don't just disappear because someone signed a treaty. This is the story we don't tell very often, the story of what happened after the war ended, after the parades were over and the newsreels stopped rolling and the country moved on to other things. The story of the men who came home with invisible wounds that no one knew how to treat, in an era that didn't have a vocabulary for trauma or PTSD or survivor's guilt. The story of men who drank to forget, who couldn't sleep, who couldn't hold jobs, who couldn't connect with their wives or their children because some essential part of them had been left behind on a beach in Normandy or a field in Belgium or a prison camp in the Pacific. The story of men who succeeded despite everything, who built families and careers and lives that looked, from the outside, perfectly normal, but who carried a weight that never lifted, a darkness that never fully went away, and the story of the men who didn't make it. Who came home physically intact but spiritually destroyed, who ended their own lives in quiet desperation in the years and decades after the war, their deaths never counted among the casualties, their suffering never acknowledged. The veterans of World War II are called the greatest generation, and perhaps they were, but greatness comes at a cost. And for many of these men, the cost was paid not during the war, but after it, in the long, difficult, often lonely decades that followed when they had to figure out how to live with what they'd seen and done in a world that didn't want to hear about it. This is their story, not the story of victory, not the story of heroism, the story of survival. There were roughly 16 million Americans who served in World War II, 16 million people who put on uniforms and went to war. By the time it ended, more than 400,000 of them were dead. Another 670,000 were wounded. Those numbers are staggering, almost incomprehensible, but they're just numbers. What's harder to quantify is how many came home damaged in ways that didn't show up on medical reports. How many had what they called shell shock or battle fatigue, what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder? How many self-medicated with alcohol? How many marriages fell apart because the man who came home wasn't the same man who'd left? How many children grew up with fathers who were physically present but emotionally absent, haunted by memories they couldn't or wouldn't share? We don't know. Because for the most part, no one asked. In 1945, the prevailing attitude towards psychological trauma was simple. Get over it. Be a man. Don't complain. You survived, didn't you? You should be grateful. Other men had it worse. Other men didn't come home at all, so count your blessings, get a job, start a family, and move on. That was the message. spoken and unspoken, from doctors, from the Veterans Administration, from friends and family and society at large. The war was over. It was time to look forward, not back. Time to build, not dwell. Time to be normal. But normal was impossible for many of these men. Normal meant sleeping through the night without waking up drenched in sweat, seeing faces you couldn't save. Normal meant going to a 4th of July fireworks show without dropping to the ground at the first explosion. Normal meant sitting at a dinner table with your family and actually being present, not staring into the distance, lost in memories of things you could never explain. Normal meant forgetting, and some things can't be forgotten, so they did what they could. They went through the motions. They got jobs, good jobs, many of them thanks to the GI Bill, which gave veterans access to education and home loans and opportunities that had been unimaginable before the war. They got married, bought houses in the new suburbs springing up across America, had children, went to church, mowed their lawns. From the outside, it looked like success, the American dream realized, but inside many of them were still at war. Their wives noticed, the children noticed, even if they didn't understand what they were noticing. The sudden angers, the long silences, the drinking, the nightmares, the way their father would sometimes look at them as if he were seeing someone else, someone far away. But no one talked about it, because that's not what you did. You didn't air your problems in public. You didn't complain. You certainly didn't suggest that the war hero sitting across from you at the breakfast table was struggling, was broken, was suffering in ways that had no visible wounds. You kept it to yourself. You carried it alone. And that's what most of them did, for years, for decades, for the rest of their lives. This is not a story with easy answers or happy endings. It's a story about the long shadow cast by war, the shadow that falls not on battlefields but on kitchen tables and front porches and quiet bedrooms in the middle of the night. It's a story about what we ask of the people we send to war and what we owe them when they come back. It's a story that's still being written because the children and grandchildren of these men are still discovering the truth about what their fathers and grandfathers went through, still finding letters that were never sent, still hearing stories that were never told, still trying to understand the silences. And it's a story that matters because we're still sending people to war, still asking them to do impossible things, still expecting them to come home and be fine. They deserve better than that. The men of World War II deserved better than that. And maybe by telling their story, the real story, the complicated story, the story that doesn't fit neatly into a 2-hour movie, we can begin to understand what war actually costs. Not just in lives lost on the battlefield, but in the decades that follow, when the battles are over but the war continues, inside the minds and hearts of the men who fought it. This is that story. The ships started arriving in the fall of 1945. They came into New York Harbor, into San Francisco Bay, into ports all along the Atlantic and Pacific coasts. Troop ships, converted luxury liners, cargo vessels, anything that could carry men. The decks were packed with soldiers, thousands of them, crowding the rails, trying to catch their first glimpse of home. Some of them had been gone for 4 years. Some had been captured, spent years in prisoner of war camps, and were only now being repatriated. Some were wounded, on stretchers, being carried off the ships to hospitals. And some, most of them, were just tired, bone tired. The kind of tired that sleep doesn't fix. There were celebrations, ticker-tape parades in major cities, families waiting at the docks, scanning the crowds of uniformed men for a familiar face, tears, embraces, relief and joy, and the overwhelming sense that the nightmare was finally over. But even in those moments of reunion, there was something off, something unspoken. The men coming home weren't quite the same men who'd left. They looked different, thinner, harder, older than their years. Their eyes had seen things that couldn't be unseen. Their hands had done things that couldn't be undone, and the people waiting for them, parents, wives, girlfriends, siblings, could sense it, even if they couldn't name it. There was a distance, a gap that hadn't been there before. The war had changed everyone, but it had changed the soldiers in ways that were difficult to articulate and impossible to share with people who hadn't been there. How do you explain what it's like to watch a friend bleed out in your arms? How do you describe the smell of a bombed-out city, the sound of incoming artillery, the feeling of terror so profound it becomes almost routine? How do you make someone understand that you're not the person they remember, that you left that person behind somewhere in Europe or the Pacific, and you don't know if you'll ever find him again? You don't, you can't, so you don't try. Instead, you smile, you hug your mother, you kiss your wife, you tell everyone you're fine, that it's good to be home, that you're ready to get back to normal life. And then you try to figure out what normal life even means. For many veterans, the first few months back were disorienting. The world had kept turning while they were gone. People had gone to work, gone to school, fallen in love, had babies, lived their lives. The war had been happening somewhere else, something they read about in newspapers or saw in newsreels at the movie theatre. It was real, but it was also abstract, distant. For the soldiers, it had been everything. The war was all-consuming, the only reality that mattered, and now suddenly they were supposed to care about things that seemed trivial by comparison. Jobs, mortgages, what to have for dinner. It felt impossible. Some men threw themselves into work, desperate for structure and purpose. The GI Bill offered unprecedented opportunities: college educations, vocational training, low-interest home loans. Millions of veterans took advantage of it, earning degrees, learning trades, starting businesses. The post-war economic boom was built, in large part, on the backs of these men who worked long hours and didn't complain, and built lives that looked, from the outside, extraordinarily successful. But success didn't mean healing. A man could have a good job, a nice house, a loving family, and still wake up at 3 a.m. soaked in sweat, his heart racing, his mind replaying the moment his landing craft hit the beach at Omaha, the moment the mortar shell landed too close, the moment he had to decide whether to shoot or be shot. He could sit at his daughter's piano recital and suddenly be somewhere else entirely, his mind triggered by a sound or a smell or nothing at all, pulled back into a memory so vivid it felt more real than the present. He could go months, even years, feeling relatively stable, and then something would happen: a backfiring car, a 4th of July firework, a violent scene in a movie, and he'd be right back there in the war, his body flooded with adrenaline, his mind on high alert, ready for a danger that no longer existed. This is what we now call PTSD. Post-traumatic stress disorder, a recognized medical condition with treatments and therapies and a growing understanding of how trauma affects the brain. But in 1945, 1950, 1960, they didn't call it that. They called it weakness. They called it cowardice. They called it failure to adjust. If a veteran struggled, if he drank too much or couldn't hold down a job or lashed out at his family, the assumption was that there was something wrong with him personally, that he wasn't tough enough, that he was letting his experiences control him instead of just getting over it and moving on. The idea that trauma could have lasting psychological effects, that the brain could be wounded just like the body, that some experiences fundamentally change a person in ways that require time and help and compassion. These were not widely accepted concepts. So the veterans suffered in silence. The wives bore much of the burden. Women who'd married their sweethearts before the war, who'd waited faithfully through years of separation, who'd raised children alone and worked in factories and kept the home fires burning, expecting that when their husbands came back, everything would return to the way it was. But it didn't. The man who came home was different, distant, angry, sad, sometimes violent, often drunk. He couldn't talk about what he'd been through, and even if he wanted to, the culture of the time discouraged it. Men didn't talk about their feelings. They certainly didn't admit to being traumatized or scared or broken. That wasn't what men did. So the wives learned to navigate around the silences, to recognize the signs of a bad night, to know when to leave him alone and when to gently try to bring him back to the present, to protect the children from their father's moods, to make excuses, to hold the family together even as it felt like everything was falling apart. Many marriages survived. Many didn't. Divorce rates spiked in the years after the war. Some of it was the natural result of hasty wartime marriages between people who barely knew each other. But much of it was the simple, heartbreaking reality that the war had changed these men in ways that made intimacy difficult or impossible. How do you love someone who won't let you in? How do you build a life with someone who's emotionally absent? How do you explain to your children why their father doesn't want to play with them, why he spends hours staring out the window, why he sometimes flinches when they try to hug him? You do your best. You try to understand, but understanding only goes so far when you're living with someone who's haunted by ghosts you can't see. And then there were the children. The baby boom generation, born in the years after the war, grew up in homes shaped by their father's experiences in combat, even if those experiences were never discussed. Some children grew up with fathers who were warm and present, who managed to compartmentalize their trauma and function as loving parents. Others grew up with fathers who were physically there but emotionally unavailable, men who went through the motions of family life but never really connected. And some grew up with fathers whose trauma manifested as rage. Alcoholism was epidemic among World War II veterans, though again, no one talked about it in those terms. A man who drank too much was just a drinker, not someone self-medicating to numb unbearable memories. And alcohol didn't always make things better. Often it made things worse. It loosened inhibitions, brought buried emotions to the surface, turned sadness into anger and anger into violence. Children learned to read their father's moods, to know when to stay quiet, when to stay out of the way. They learned that their father loved them, probably, but that there was something inside him, some wound or darkness that they could never reach. Many of these children didn't understand what they were witnessing until much later, when they were adults themselves and the language for trauma and PTSD had entered the culture. Only then did they realize that their father's behavior wasn't personal, that it wasn't their fault, that the war had never really ended for him, that he'd been fighting it every day in his mind for decades. By then, in many cases, it was too late to talk about it. The father was gone, the opportunity for understanding, for reconciliation, for hearing the stories that had never been told, gone with him. And what remained was a legacy of silence, of unspoken pain passed down through generations. In 1946, the Veterans Administration was overwhelmed. Hospitals were full of wounded men, men with missing limbs, shrapnel still embedded in their bodies, burns, blindness, injuries that would require years of surgeries and rehabilitation. The medical staff worked around the clock, doing what they could with the resources available, which were never enough. But for every man with a visible wound, there were dozens more with wounds that didn't show. Men who couldn't sleep, men who couldn't stop shaking, men who heard explosions that weren't there, who saw enemy soldiers in every shadow, who couldn't be in crowds or loud spaces or anywhere that felt confining. Men who drank themselves unconscious every night because it was the only way to stop the memories. Men who sat in VA waiting rooms, trying to explain to doctors that something was wrong, desperately wrong, even though they looked fine. The doctors didn't know what to do with them. Some were sympathetic. They'd seen this before in the veterans of the First World War, men who came back from the trenches shaking and unable to function, diagnosed with shell shock and sent to asylums or simply told to pull themselves together. The term had changed by World War II. Now they called it battle fatigue or combat exhaustion, but the understanding hadn't progressed much. The prevailing medical opinion was that these psychological reactions were temporary, that with enough rest and time away from combat, the symptoms would fade, that a man's natural resilience would reassert itself and he'd return to normal. For some men, that's exactly what happened. They had rough patches in the months after coming home, but gradually adjusted, found their footing, built lives. The nightmares became less frequent, the hypervigilance eased, the war receded into the past, still there but no longer dominating every waking moment. But for many others, it didn't work that way. The symptoms didn't fade, they got worse. Or they came and went in cycles, months or years of relative stability, followed by periods of complete breakdown. And the medical establishment had no effective treatments to offer. Some doctors prescribed sedatives or barbiturates, which helped with sleep but did nothing for the underlying trauma and often led to dependency. Some recommended talk therapy, but most veterans had no interest in reliving their experiences with a stranger, especially when the culture told them that real men didn't need to talk about their feelings. Some were institutionalized, locked away in psychiatric wards, diagnosed with conditions like psychoneurosis or anxiety reaction, or simply nervous breakdown, treated with electroshock therapy or insulin shock therapy or lobotomies, brutal, often ineffective interventions that sometimes left patients worse off than before. And many received no treatment at all. They were told they were fine, that there was nothing physically wrong with them, that they just needed to try harder to adjust. So they went home and tried. And failed, and tried again. And the years passed and the wounds stayed open. The thing about psychological trauma is that it doesn't follow a straight line. A man could be fine for months, even years. He could build a career, raise children, participate in his community, appear to everyone around him as perfectly normal and well-adjusted. And then something would trigger him. A smell, a sound, an anniversary, a news report, and suddenly he'd be back in the war, experiencing it as vividly as if it were happening in real time. These episodes could last hours or days. During them, the veteran might become withdrawn, irritable, unable to concentrate or connect with the people around him. He might drink heavily or drive recklessly or pick fights. He might have panic attacks, his heart racing, his breath coming in short gasps, convinced he was dying even though all the medical tests said he was fine. And then just as suddenly, the episode would pass. He'd come back to himself, exhausted and ashamed, unable to explain what had just happened or why. His family learned to accommodate these episodes, to give him space when he needed it, to not ask questions, to pretend everything was normal once the storm had passed, because that's what you did. You didn't make a fuss. You didn't draw attention to problems that couldn't be fixed. You protected the family's reputation, maintained appearances, kept private matters private. The cost of this silence was high. Children grew up walking on eggshells, never quite sure what would set their father off. Wives became expert at reading moods, at managing their husband's trauma while suppressing their own needs and frustrations. And the veterans themselves became increasingly isolated, convinced that no one could understand what they'd been through, that they were fundamentally broken in ways that couldn't be repaired. Many of them believed this until the day they died. There were some who tried to talk about it. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, a few books and films began to address the psychological aftermath of war. The Best Years of Our Lives, released in 1946, depicted 3 veterans struggling to readjust to civilian life, including one suffering from what we'd now recognize as PTSD. It was groundbreaking for its time, honest in its portrayal of the difficulties veterans faced, but it was also an outlier. Most cultural representations of World War II focused on heroism, sacrifice, and triumph. The message was clear. The war was won, the veterans were heroes, and America was entering a golden age of prosperity and strength. Anything that complicated that narrative, anything that suggested the veterans were struggling, that the war had damaged them in lasting ways, that victory had come at a psychological cost no one wanted to calculate, was quietly pushed aside. The veterans themselves internalized this message. They'd been told they were heroes, and heroes didn't complain. Heroes didn't break down. Heroes didn't need help. So they kept silent. They went to work every day. They came home to their families. They mowed their lawns and coached Little League and went to church and did all the things that normal, well-adjusted American men were supposed to do. And at night alone, they remembered. They remembered the faces of the men who died next to them. They remembered the sounds and smells of combat. They remembered the things they'd done, the people they'd killed, the moral compromises they'd made in order to survive, and they carried it, alone, for decades. The irony is that many of these men would have benefited enormously from simply being able to talk to each other. Other veterans understood. Other men who'd been there, who'd seen the same things, who woke up with the same nightmares. They could have provided the support and validation that families and doctors couldn't. But the culture of the time discouraged this kind of sharing. The veteran service organizations, the VFW, the American Legion, existed, and many men joined them. But the activities centered around socializing and community service, not processing trauma. The unspoken rule was that you didn't talk about the bad parts. You swapped stories about the funny moments, the close calls that ended well, the bonds of brotherhood. You didn't talk about fear or grief or guilt. It wasn't until much later, decades later in some cases, that veterans began to open up to each other in meaningful ways. And by then, time had done its damage. Patterns had been set, families had been shaped by decades of silence, and many of the veterans were elderly, their chance to fully process and heal from their trauma long past. The ones who did finally talk often expressed the same regret. I wish I'd done this sooner. I wish I'd known I wasn't alone. I wish someone had told me it was okay to not be okay. But no one did, because the culture didn't allow for it. And so an entire generation of men suffered in silence, carrying wounds that never healed, fighting a war that never ended, dying with stories still locked inside them. We know more now. We understand trauma better. We have treatments, cognitive behavioral therapy, EMDR, medications that actually help with PTSD symptoms rather than just sedating patients into numbness. We have a language for what these men experienced. We recognize that psychological wounds are real wounds, that they require treatment and compassion and time to heal. But we learned all of this too late for the World War II generation. They came home to a country that celebrated them but didn't understand them, that expected them to be strong and silent and unbroken, that offered parades instead of therapy, medals instead of meaningful support. And most of them did their best to live up to those expectations. They suppressed their trauma, they functioned, they built the post-war world, suburbs and highways, and corporations and families. But the cost was enormous, and it was paid in silence, in private, in countless small tragedies that never made the headlines. Marriages that dissolved, relationships with children that never quite formed, potential that was never realized because so much energy went into simply managing the day-to-day reality of living with untreated trauma, and lives that ended too soon, not on battlefields but in quiet desperation, decades after the war when the weight finally became too much to bear. These casualties were never counted, but they were real. On paper, the post-war years were a triumph for American veterans. The GI Bill, signed into law in 1944, was one of the most successful pieces of social legislation in American history. It provided veterans with unemployment benefits, low-interest home loans, and funding for education and vocational training. By 1956, nearly 8 million veterans had taken advantage of the education benefits, earning college degrees or learning trades that transformed their economic prospects. The results were visible everywhere. Entire suburbs sprang up, filled with modest homes purchased with VA loans. College campuses swelled with older students, men in their 20s and 30s sitting in classrooms alongside teenagers, working toward degrees in engineering, business, education. Companies hired them, banks lent to them, politicians courted them. The veterans became doctors, lawyers, teachers, business owners. They built careers in the booming post-war economy. They started families, lots of them, creating the baby boom that would define a generation. They joined churches and civic organizations. They became coaches, scout leaders, local officials. From the outside, it looked like the American dream in action. A generation of men who'd sacrificed for their country, returning to claim their reward, prosperity, stability, normalcy. But success and healing are not the same thing. A man could have a good job, a nice house, a loving family, and still be profoundly damaged by his experiences in the war. Could still wake up screaming, could still drink himself to sleep, could still feel like he was living his life from behind a pane of glass, watching himself go through the motions but never quite present, never quite whole. The external markers of success often masked internal devastation. Take the story of a man we'll call Robert. Robert landed on Omaha Beach on D-Day. He was 19 years old. He watched men die all around him, cut down by machine gun fire, blown apart by mortars, drowning in the surf weighed down by their equipment. He made it off the beach, fought his way through France, survived the Battle of the Bulge. Came home in early 1946 with a Purple Heart and memories he couldn't escape. He used the GI Bill to go to college, earned a degree in engineering, got a job with a good company, married his high school sweetheart, had 3 children, bought a house in the suburbs, coached his son's Little League team, went to church every Sunday. To his neighbors, to his colleagues, to almost everyone who knew him, Robert was the embodiment of the successful veteran. Hard-working, reliable, devoted to his family, a pillar of the community. But his wife knew differently. She knew about the nightmares that woke him 3 or 4 times a week, leaving him gasping and disoriented. She knew about the drinking, not enough to be obvious to outsiders, but enough that she could track his stress levels by how much whiskey disappeared from the bottle in the kitchen cabinet. She knew that certain sounds, thunderstorms, backfiring cars, fireworks, would send him into a state of hyper-alert tension that could last for hours or days. That man! She knew that he sometimes looked at their children as if he didn't recognize them, as if he were somewhere else entirely, that he could be emotionally absent for weeks at a time, going through the motions of family life but not really there, that he'd never told her, not in any detail, what he'd experienced during the war, and she'd learned not to ask. She loved him. She stayed with him. She protected the children from his darker moments and made excuses when necessary and held the family together. But she was lonely, married to a man who was physically present but emotionally unreachable, raising children with a father who loved them but couldn't quite connect with them, building a life that looked perfect from the outside but felt hollow from within. This was the reality for countless families. The veterans built lives, good lives in many cases, but those lives were haunted by the war, shaped by trauma that was never acknowledged and never treated. The workplace became, for many men, a refuge. Work was concrete. It had clear expectations, measurable outcomes, a structure that made sense. You showed up, you did your job, you got paid. There was a simplicity to it that other areas of life lacked. Many veterans threw themselves into their careers with an intensity that was both admirable and destructive. They worked long hours, took on extra responsibilities, climbed corporate ladders, or built businesses, or pursued professions with single-minded focus. Some did this out of genuine ambition. Others did it because work was the one place where they could feel competent and in control, where the chaos of their internal world didn't intrude quite so much. And some did it simply to avoid being home, to avoid the intimacy and emotional demands of family life that felt overwhelming or impossible. The result was a generation of men who were often more comfortable at the office than in their own living rooms. Who knew their colleagues better than they knew their children? Who could talk about business or sports or politics but couldn't talk about feelings or fears or the things that kept them up at night? Their children noticed. Many baby boomers grew up with fathers who were distant, who worked all the time, who were present for dinner but absent in every way that mattered, who provided financially but not emotionally, who seemed in some fundamental way disconnected from family life. Only later, much later, did many of these children realize that their father's distance wasn't personal, that it wasn't about them, that it was about a war that had ended before they were born but had never really ended for their father. By then, in many cases, it was too late to bridge that gap. Not every veteran struggled, it's important to say that. Many men came home and adjusted well. They processed their experiences in healthy ways, built strong relationships, lived full and satisfying lives largely untroubled by their wartime service. But even among these men, there were often moments, triggered by a news report, a movie, an anniversary, a conversation, when the war came rushing back. When they were transported for a few seconds or minutes or hours, back to a place they'd thought they'd left behind. And even the most well-adjusted veterans often kept parts of their experience locked away, stories they never told, things they saw or did that they couldn't share, even with the people closest to them. There were things that couldn't be spoken, things that, once said aloud, might change how people saw them, might shatter the image of the heroic veteran that everyone wanted to maintain. So they kept those things to themselves, carried them in silence. And the weight of that silence, accumulated over decades, was its own kind of burden. The truly tragic cases were the men who couldn't adjust at all, the veterans who came home and tried but couldn't make it work, who drank too much and lost their jobs, who became violent and lost their families, who ended up homeless, living on the streets, unable to navigate the basic requirements of civilian life. In the 1950s and 60s, you could find them in every major city. Men in their 30s and 40s, clearly veterans, living in flop houses or under bridges, panhandling for enough money to buy their next drink. Men who'd fought for their country and been discarded by it when they came back broken. They were embarrassments, failures, proof that not every veteran was a hero, and society largely ignored them or treated them with contempt. It wasn't until much later that we began to understand that homelessness among veterans was often a direct result of untreated PTSD and the lack of adequate mental health support. That these men weren't weak or lazy or morally deficient. They were casualties of war, just as surely as the men who died on the battlefield. But by the time we understood that, most of them were gone. They died in obscurity, from exposure, from liver failure, from violence, from suicide. Their deaths were rarely noted, their sacrifices were forgotten, and the connection between their service and their suffering was never acknowledged. These men deserve better. They deserve treatment, support, compassion. They deserve to be recognized as what they were, veterans who'd given everything, including their sanity, for their country. But they didn't get that. They got indifference and judgment, and a society that had moved on that didn't want to be reminded of the cost of war. And then there were the suicides. No one knows how many World War II veterans took their own lives. The statistics weren't kept, or, if they weren't preserved in a form that allows for analysis. Suicide was stigmatized, often covered up by families, sometimes misreported as accidents to spare the family shame. But the anecdotal evidence is overwhelming. Every veteran community has stories of men who seemed fine, who were functioning, who had jobs and families, and who one day simply decided they couldn't go on, who shot themselves in their garages or hung themselves in their basements or drove their cars into trees at high speed. Some left notes, some didn't, but the pattern was clear. Decades after the war ended, men were still dying from it. Not from physical wounds, but from psychological ones that had never healed, that had festered for 20 or 30 or 40 years until the pain became unbearable. Their families were left with questions that could never be answered. Why now? Why after all this time? What finally pushed him over the edge? Often there was no clear trigger. Or the trigger was something that seemed small, a health scare, a job loss, a grandchild's birth that reminded the veteran of his own mortality. Something that, for reasons no one could quite articulate, made the weight of decades of suppressed trauma suddenly impossible to bear. These deaths were tragedies, but they were also, in a sense, war casualties. Men killed by experiences they'd had in 1944 or 1945, experiences that had been slowly destroying them from the inside for decades. They deserved to be counted among the cost of the war, but they never were. Something began to shift in the 1970s and 1980s. It started with Vietnam. The veterans coming home from that war were struggling openly in ways that World War II veterans never had. They were angry, traumatized, unable to find jobs or reintegrate into society. And unlike their fathers and grandfathers, they weren't staying silent about it. They organized, they protested, they demanded recognition and support. And gradually, haltingly, the medical and psychiatric establishment began to take trauma seriously in ways it never had before. In 1980, the American Psychiatric Association officially recognized post-traumatic stress disorder in the DSM-3, the diagnostic manual used by mental health professionals. For the first time, there was a formal diagnosis, a recognized medical condition, a framework for understanding and treating the psychological aftermath of trauma. It was, in many ways, too late for the World War II generation. Most of them were in their 50s, 60s, or older by then. Decades had passed. Patterns had been set, damage had been done, but the recognition mattered. It validated what many of them had known all along, that what they were experiencing wasn't weakness or moral failing, but a legitimate response to unbearable stress, that they weren't alone, that what had happened to them had a name. Some of the World War II veterans, hearing about PTSD for the first time, felt a kind of relief, a sense of, finally, someone understands. Finally, there's a word for this thing I've been living with for 40 years. A few sought treatment, went to VA counselors, tried therapy, attended support groups. Some found it helpful. Others felt it was too little, too late, that they'd already lived most of their lives with their trauma, that it was too deeply embedded to root out now. And many never sought help at all. They were too old, too set in their ways, too convinced that they didn't need it, or that it wouldn't work, or that real men didn't talk about their feelings with strangers. But something else was happening, something quieter, but perhaps more significant. The veterans were getting older, retiring, facing their own mortality. And in those final years, some of them began to talk. It often started with the grandchildren. The children of World War II veterans had grown up with their father's silence. They'd learned not to ask about the war. They knew it was a sensitive subject, one that made their fathers uncomfortable or angry or distant. But the grandchildren didn't know that. They were curious. They asked innocent questions. What was it like? Were you scared? Did you kill anyone? And sometimes, unexpectedly, the grandfather would answer. Not to his children who'd been asking for decades, but to this grandchild who asked with genuine curiosity and no expectation, no judgment. To this young person who saw him not as a father or husband with responsibilities and expectations, but simply as an old man with stories. And the stories would come out, not all at once, not in any organized way, just fragments, memories, pieces of experiences that had been locked away for 50 years. A moment on a beach in Normandy, the face of a friend who didn't make it home, the sound of artillery, the fear, the exhaustion, the things he'd seen, the things he'd done. The grandchildren listened. Some of them recorded these conversations, some wrote them down, and gradually a record began to form. Oral histories, memoirs, testimonies that captured the reality of what these men had experienced and carried. It wasn't comprehensive. Many veterans died without ever talking. Many took their stories to the grave, maintaining their silence to the very end. But enough spoke that we have now a fuller picture, a more honest accounting of what the war was like and what it cost the men who fought it. The pattern was familiar. The veteran would talk, often in fits and starts, sometimes crying, sometimes distant and matter-of-fact. And at the end, he would often say something like, "I've never told anyone this before." I don't know why I'm telling you now. The reasons varied, but they shared common threads. Age had softened some of the defences. Retirement meant time to reflect. The death of fellow veterans meant fewer people left who would understand, but also fewer people to judge. And the simple fact of being old, of facing death, made the secret seem less important to keep. What did it matter now? The war was 50 years ago. Everyone they'd been trying to protect, wives, children, their own reputations, had already formed their opinions, lived their lives. The damage, if it was damage, was done. So some of them decided to unburden themselves. To finally, after decades of silence, tell the truth about what they'd experienced. The process wasn't always healing. Some veterans found it cathartic, a relief to finally share the weight they'd been carrying. Others found it re-traumatizing, the act of remembering and articulating, bringing the memories back with a vividness they'd tried to suppress. And some found that the people they told didn't know how to respond, that their children or grandchildren, confronted with stories of violence and fear and moral compromise, were uncomfortable or shocked or simply didn't know what to say. But at least the stories were told. At least there was a record. The institutional recognition came even later. For decades, the Department of Veterans Affairs had been reluctant to acknowledge the extent of psychological trauma among World War II veterans. The focus had been on physical injuries, on pensions and disability payments for men with visible wounds. But as Vietnam veterans began to demand treatment for PTSD, and as the diagnosis became more accepted in the medical community, the VA slowly began to expand its mental health services. Programs were created, counselors were hired, research was conducted, and gradually it became clear that PTSD wasn't just a Vietnam phenomenon. It affected veterans of every conflict, including World War II. Studies began to show that significant percentages of World War II veterans met the diagnostic criteria for PTSD, even decades after the war. By the time this research was published, most of the veterans were in their 70s or 80s. Many were dead, but for those still living, there was finally official recognition. The VA began offering PTSD treatment specifically designed for older veterans. Support groups were formed. Therapists who specialized in treating elderly patients with long-standing trauma became more common. It helped some men. For others, it was too late. Their trauma was too deeply ingrained, their lives too fully shaped by decades of untreated suffering. But the acknowledgement mattered. The recognition that what they'd experienced was real, was serious, was worthy of attention and care. That mattered. Even if it came 40, 50, 60 years too late. The younger generation began to understand. The children who'd grown up with distant, sometimes difficult fathers began to connect the dots. To realize that their father's anger or drinking or emotional unavailability wasn't personal, wasn't about them, that it was about the war, about experiences so traumatic that they'd shaped everything that came after. This understanding often brought a kind of grief for the relationship they might have had if their father had received help, if the culture had been different, if PTSD had been recognized and treated. Grief for their father's suffering, which they'd witnessed but hadn't understood. Grief for all the lost years, the missed opportunities for connection. But it also brought compassion, an ability to see their father not as a failure or as someone who'd let them down, but as a wounded man who'd done his best with resources and support that were woefully inadequate. Many adult children of World War II veterans began their own healing processes, working through the ways their father's trauma had affected them. Recognizing patterns in their own lives, difficulty with intimacy, hypervigilance, a tendency toward emotional suppression that had been passed down, learned in childhood from fathers who were themselves coping with untreated PTSD. The trauma, it turned out, wasn't contained to one generation. It rippled outward, affecting families in ways that wouldn't be fully understood for decades. There were moments of public reckoning too. In the 1990s and 2000s, as the World War II generation entered their final years, there was a cultural shift. The war, which had been celebrated but not deeply examined, became the subject of renewed interest. Books like Stephen Ambrose's Oral Histories brought veterans' stories to a wide audience. Films like Saving Private Ryan depicted the brutality of combat with an honesty that earlier war movies had avoided. Museums and memorials were built. Tom Brokaw's The Greatest Generation became a bestseller. There was a rush to honor these men before they were gone, to thank them, to preserve their stories, to ensure they weren't forgotten. It was well-intentioned, but it was also, in some ways, a continuation of the same pattern that had existed since 1945, celebrating the veterans' sacrifice while glossing over their suffering. The focus was on heroism, not on trauma, on triumph, not on cost. The narrative was still about the greatest generation, not about the deeply wounded generation. There were exceptions. Some oral history projects made space for veterans to talk about fear, loss, grief. Some documentaries addressed PTSD. Some families encouraged their veteran fathers or grandfathers to speak honestly, to share the difficult parts of their experience. But the dominant cultural narrative remained celebratory, and many veterans, even in their final years, felt pressure to conform to that narrative. To be the hero everyone wanted them to be, rather than the complex, damaged, still hurting person they actually were. The last of the World War II veterans are dying now. More than 16 million Americans served. Fewer than 100,000 are still alive, and that number shrinks every day. Soon, within the next few years, the last one will die, and the generation will pass from living memory into history. What will we remember about them? The parades, the victories, the medals and monuments? Or will we also remember their pain, the decades of silence, the marriages strained and broken, the children who grew up with fathers who were physically present but emotionally absent, the men who drank themselves to death or took their own lives because the weight of what they'd carried became too much? Will we remember that the war didn't end in 1945, not for them, that it continued in their minds and hearts for the rest of their lives? Will we count the full cost? There's a question that haunts anyone who looks closely at what happened to the veterans of World War II after the war ended. Could it have been different? Could these men have been spared some of their suffering if the culture had been different, if medical understanding had been better, if the support systems had existed that we have now, imperfect as they are? The answer, almost certainly, is yes. We know now what we didn't know then, that psychological trauma is real, that it can be treated, that silence and suppression make it worse. We know that men who are encouraged to talk about their experiences, who receive therapy and support, who are allowed to be vulnerable and to heal, do better than men who are told to be strong and silent and to just get over it. We know that creating space for veterans to process what they've been through, to grieve, to rage, to feel fear without shame, is essential to their recovery. That connection with other veterans, with people who understand, can be profoundly healing. That families need support too, that living with someone with PTSD is difficult, and that caregivers need resources and understanding. We know all of this now, but we didn't know it then, or if some people knew it, the knowledge wasn't widespread, wasn't institutionalized, wasn't part of the culture. And so an entire generation of men suffered in ways that, with different choices and better understanding, might have been preventable or at least reducible. That's the tragedy. Not that these men experience trauma. War is inherently traumatic, and there's no way to completely protect people from the psychological impact of combat, but that they were forced to carry that trauma alone in silence without adequate support or treatment for the rest of their lives. They deserve better. The debt we owe to these men is complicated. On one level, it's the debt any society owes to its veterans: gratitude for their service, support for their needs, recognition of their sacrifice. And to some extent, we've paid that debt. The VA exists, benefits exist, monuments and memorials exist. But on another level, the debt is about honesty. These men were asked to do terrible things, to kill, to witness death on a massive scale, to make impossible moral choices under extreme stress, to suppress their own fear and humanity in service of a larger cause. And when they came home, they were expected to pretend it hadn't changed them, to go back to being the people they were before, as if years of combat could be erased by simply taking off the uniform. We asked too much, and when they struggled under the weight of what we'd asked, we judged them for it, called them weak or damaged or unable to adjust. The honest accounting we owe them is this: acknowledgement that what we asked was nearly impossible, that many of them broke under the weight of it, and that breaking doesn't make them failures, it makes them human. That the cost of the war wasn't just the 400,000 who died in combat, but also the hundreds of thousands who came home and died slowly, killed by wounds we couldn't see and didn't treat. We need to count all the casualties, not just the ones who fell on battlefields, but the ones who fell in living rooms and garages and lonely hotel rooms, decades later, when the trauma finally became too much. They were casualties of war just as surely as the men whose names are carved on memorials, and they deserve to be remembered as such. The story of what happened to these soldiers after the war ended is not a comfortable story. It doesn't fit neatly into the narrative of American triumph. It complicates the image of the greatest generation. It forces us to confront the reality that war damages people in lasting ways, that victory has a cost that extends far beyond the battlefield, that the men we send to fight carry the consequences for the rest of their lives. But it's a story that needs to be told, not to diminish their sacrifice, not to suggest that the war wasn't worth fighting. It was. The defeat of fascism was a moral necessity, and the men who fought to achieve it did something profoundly important. But we can honor their service while also being honest about what it cost them. We can celebrate their courage while also acknowledging their pain. We can call them heroes while also recognizing that many of them didn't feel like heroes, that they felt damaged and broken and lost, that they struggled every day for decades with memories and emotions they couldn't escape. The truth is complicated. Humans are complicated. War is complicated. And the men who fought World War II were not mythic figures. They were young men, boys really, who were asked to do extraordinary things under horrifying circumstances. Some rose to the occasion. Some broke. Most fell somewhere in between, doing their best and carrying the scars forever. They deserve to be remembered in their full humanity. Not as cardboard cutouts or propaganda figures, but as real people with real struggles, who sacrificed enormously and paid a price that continued for the rest of their lives. There are lessons here for us. We're still sending people to war. Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, smaller conflicts and operations that don't make headlines. Young men and women who volunteer, who deploy, who come home changed. And we're still in many ways making the same mistakes. We've gotten better. We have PTSD treatment now. We have programs and resources. The stigma around mental health has decreased, at least somewhat, but we still send people to war and expect them to come home fine. We still celebrate their service without fully reckoning with the cost. We still have veterans who are homeless, who are struggling, who take their own lives at rates far higher than the civilian population. The lessons of World War II, that war damages people, that they need support, that silence and suppression don't work, that society has an obligation to care for the people it sends to fight, haven't been fully learned. Maybe they can't be. Maybe every generation has to learn them anew through the suffering of its own veterans. But maybe, if we're honest about what happened to the World War II generation, if we tell their story in all its painful complexity, we can do a little better. We can create cultures where veterans feel safe talking about their struggles, where seeking help is seen as strength, not weakness, where families are supported, where the full cost of war is acknowledged and addressed, not hidden away. We owe that to the veterans of World War II whose suffering was compounded by silence, and we owe it to every veteran who comes after them. The men who fought in World War II are almost gone now. In a few years they'll all be dead, and their stories will exist only in books and recordings and the memories of their children and grandchildren. What will remain is a legacy, not just of victory, but of sacrifice, not just of heroism, but of suffering, not just of what they did during the war, but of what they endured after it. They carried the weight of the war for the rest of their lives. Many carried it alone in silence, because that's what was expected of them. They deserve better. They deserve support and understanding and treatment. They deserve to be allowed to be human, to be vulnerable, to be wounded without shame. Most of them didn't get that. But their stories, told now at the end by the survivors and the families they left behind, can serve as a reminder. A reminder that war doesn't end when the fighting stops. A reminder that the costs are higher and more complicated than we usually acknowledge. A reminder that the people we send to war come back changed, and that we have an obligation to help them carry what they've experienced. And a reminder that silence doesn't heal wounds. It only buries them deeper, where they fester and spread and damage everything they touch. Now, if you're reading this and your father or grandfather was a World War II veteran, know this: whatever he struggled with, whatever darkness he carried, it wasn't your fault. It wasn't his fault either. It was the war that never really ended. The war that he fought every day in his mind, long after the guns fell silent. If he was distant or angry or sad, if he drank too much or couldn't connect or seemed lost sometimes, it wasn't because he didn't love you. It was because part of him was still there on a beach or in a forest or in a prison camp, trapped in memories that wouldn't let go. He did his best. With tools and support that were inadequate, in a culture that didn't understand, he did his best. And if his best wasn't always enough, that's not on him. It's on the war, and on a society that asked everything of him and gave back too little. The story of what happened to these soldiers after the war ended is ultimately a human story. It's about men trying to live with the unlivable, trying to build normal lives on foundations shattered by trauma, trying to be husbands and fathers and workers and citizens while carrying weights that no one could see and few understood. Some succeeded, more or less. They built good lives, raised families, made contributions. The trauma was there, always, but they managed it well enough to function. Others didn't. They broke. They fell apart. They died, sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly over decades. Most fell somewhere in between, lives that were both successful and haunted, families that were loving but strained, men who were present but also somehow absent, there but not quite there. All of them deserve to be remembered, not just for what they did in the war, but for what they carried after it. Not just for their strength, but for their vulnerability. Not just for their victories, but for their struggles. They were the generation that saved the world, and the world in many ways failed to save them. That's the truth. Uncomfortable, complicated, painful, but true. And truth, even painful truth, is what we owe them. It's the last debt, the final honor, to remember them as they actually were, human beings who gave everything, who sacrificed enormously, and who carried the cost of that sacrifice for the rest of their lives. They deserve nothing less.